All right, we're looking at the fourth edition or fourth lecture in this series of Forming the Nation. Forming the Nation is our looking at the first 7 presidents of the United States. And we're going to go through Andrew Jackson today, the 7th president of the United States. And we're going to take a look at the rise of nationalism. And nationalism is the idea that I take pride in our country, not just the state I'm from or the section of the country like the South or the North or a city like New York, but the entire nation and patriotism towards our nation. Earlier in the lecture, we were talking about the Supreme Court and its rise to equality with the legislative branch, Congress, and the executive branch, the presidency, and that was done by Marbury versus Madison. And now we're going to take a look how the Supreme Court and its rulings really established the nation and the power of the nation over state power. And there's 2 important Supreme Court cases that we want you to look at and know. And the first one is a case in 1824 that was 2 steamboat operators. And both steamboat operators, we were running products and people by waterway, just like we do today, and product through rivers. And it dealt with New York and New Jersey. And the bottom line was that, and you're not going to need to know the specifics of the case, but what you need to know is the importance of the case. And these two steamboat operators, one had been granted the rights exclusively by the state of New York to operate their steamboat, and the other one was given to it by the federal government. And the Supreme Court ruled that the U.S. Congress alone had the power to oversee commerce. And it's going to be the Commerce Clause within the Constitution that says they have the right to oversee business dealings between 2 states. So if there's a conflict between Idaho and Washington, the federal government will make a ruling and their government deals and will have the final say in anything that has to deal with commerce/business. And that's absolutely imperative, because now we've established that the federal government will decide anything between states. It won't be just if it happens in the state of Idaho, then people get what they want if they're in Idaho. It will be done by the federal government. And so Gibbons versus Ogden, 1824, the big one you need to remember is the Commerce Clause, and that Congress has the power to oversee any interstate commerce or business. The second one dealt with McCulloch versus Maryland. And in this, we had the state of Maryland trying to actually break the U.S. bank by taxing it. The state of Maryland was taxing the U.S. federal bank and trying to collect revenue for the state of Maryland. And the Supreme Court said, no, you do not have the right to tax a federal bank. And that the federal government does have the right to control the economy, and that the national government is over state governments. So if we have a law that is in conflict with a state law, the state is below the federal law. Now, if the federal law goes against the Constitution, or the federal law is found to contradict something in previous, then that would be found to be unconstitutional. But if there's 2 laws, the state of Idaho passes a law that would permit something that is against the federal law, the state of Idaho would lose that battle. And that was established versus McCulloch versus Maryland. Nationalism, as I mentioned at the beginning, is the belief that national interests outweigh regional or local interests. And in 1823, President James Monroe wrote a speech to Congress, and within the speech, fairly far down in the speech, Monroe talks and addresses the attempt by other countries, European countries, to establish themselves with colonies in our part of the world, the Western Hemisphere. So not just the United States, but all of the Western Hemisphere, which would be all of North America, Central and South America. And he says to the world, don't interfere in the Western Hemisphere, and then we will stay out of your affairs over in Europe and Asia. And it's a bold statement, one that I don't think we would have been able to enforce had we had not probably gotten the blessing from England. England was trying to keep its empire afloat, its imperialistic empire afloat other places, and they did not want to see France or Spain or Portugal get a foothold back over here in this part of the world. So they agreed with us to say, no, we think that the United States does have the right to make this assessment. As far as us staying out of the affairs of Europe, it won't be long until we're into some places in Europe, and then we'll be the same thing in Asia. But for the time being, we tell the world, stay out of our backyard. And if you don't stay out of our backyard, then we're going to have a fight. And that's going to stay in place and for the next 150 years. One of the things that nationalism is also going to do is there is a push as we buy the Louisiana Purchase for people to start moving. The government starts giving incentives to people to move out west. We give them an opportunity to buy land at an incredible price. And as long as they can show that they are using the land and they're developing the land that they can have this land for a 160 acres for a very, very cheap price. And it's the opportunity to have a better living and a better life. And the idea that the United States is expanding, and we'll talk about in our next unit, we'll talk about manifest destiny and the right of the white man to move out west. And I don't want to go too far into that. As people would start to move and we started getting more and more people to move, basically how it worked was the federal government said, as we get more and more people into an area, you can start to call that area a territory. That was at about 60,000 people. And when it became a territory, and when that territory got enough to be at 60,000 people, then it could declare for statehood, and then it would be voted on by the U.S. Congress. And so you'll start to see different states within the Ohio Valley become states. And as we move more and more out west, you'll see eventually the sections grow to where it's going to be a territory, the territory of Montana, and then it'll become a state, and the state of Idaho, Oregon, Washington, and so forth. But it's the idea that we're going to move as a nation and push ourselves westward and give incredible opportunities to people that is going to grow as the nation grows. The people's pride in our country grows. One of the things we're going to get, though, is, as we were talking about last week, was the idea of the cotton gin, and that the northern part of our country is going to be more manufacturing and the southern part is going to be more farming. There's going to be this split. There's going to start to be this divide. And by the early 1820, 1821, you're going to start to see some real contentious beliefs between people of the South and of the North. Both sections, I should say, of our country are feeling like the other section is trying to impose their will onto them. So today you have a definite battle between conservative and liberal, maybe Democrat and Republican, if you'd like. There it was some of the same issues, but one of the big issues that stood out there was slavery. And in the North, we don't use slaves. In the South, you're going to use slaves on large plantations, large farms. Most small farms didn't have them. But in 1820, what was the or why did we need this compromise, and what was it? The Missouri Compromise and why we need it was there was, as mentioned, a bunch of tensions between the United States and those states that had slaves. There were 10 states that had slaves, and there were 10 free states or no slave states. And as we started to move and started to have territories become states, we were afraid that if one or the other side had a majority, then they would rule to abolish or accept slaves. And so, how did the Missouri Compromise work? Well, the United States Congress, again underneath 1820, underneath a gentleman by the name of Henry Clay, and this is a very, very contentious issue. We talk about the wall today that President Trump is wanting to push, and I would say that this issue was more contentious than the wall by a long ways. And what it said, they basically came together was that how is this going to be resolved for new states coming into the union? And they said anything, if we took a look at a map, anything on the 36 north latitude line, anything north of there on that latitude line, 36 latitude line, would be called no slaves. I got to correct that. It should be no slaves in those states. And anything south of there would be allowed to have slaves in them. So the 36 latitude, there's longitude and latitude, longitude up and down, latitude north, east and west. Anything north of 36 would not have slaves, and anything south of there would have slaves. Now the exception was Missouri. Missouri's actually going to be the next state that's going to come in. They felt like to be a state, they were a territory. They now had the necessary number of 60,000 people, and they are going to become a state. And so there is a large push within Missouri to become a slave state. They are farming, and so they make the exception with Missouri. Missouri will be above the 36 latitude line, and they will still be considered to be a slave state. But all the other new territories that are coming in, most of which will be above the 36, because below the 36 is still in Spanish control. All of California, New Mexico, Colorado, and that's still at this time in 1820 underneath Spain's control. And we're going to win that in the Mexican-American War, which is going to be later in the 19th century. What did the Missouri Compromise? What did the Missouri Compromise accomplish? Well, it's going to keep the peace from 1820 till 1860. For the better part of 40 years, we're going to have peace amongst our nation on a very, very hotly debated topic of slavery. And it eventually will fold when the South tries to secede from the Union. But for 40 years, this compromise of anything that's above the 36 latitude line would be non-slaves. Anything below that would be slave states. That's put into existence in 1820. Now let's take a look at President Jackson. Andrew Jackson is our 7th president in the United States. Mr. Jackson is a hero of the War of 1812 with England. He is the leader of the United States in the Battle of New Orleans. He is also a renowned Indian fighter. He has made himself into a very wealthy man, but again, he's going to, much like Jefferson, want to give the illusion or the image, maybe I should say, of being a common folk, a common person. He will run for president for being president in 1824, and he will lose that election. When the House of Representatives they will not have a majority, and the House of Representatives will make a ruling, and he will lose the 1824 election. And when he loses that, he is a somewhat of a populist, very popular figure. He's actually going to change the Democratic Republican Party. He's going to reorganize it, and the Democratic Republican Party will eventually drop the Republican name, and the Democratic Republican Party of Andrew Jackson will become the Democratic Party. So the early stages, its infancy stages of the Democratic Party come from Andrew Jackson. Jacksonian democracy had the belief that it wasn't just the elite that could be office holders. It didn't have to be someone that had a ton of land or was extremely wealthy that could be in government, but that the average man could aspire to have political power. I think that image is still being portrayed today. I mean, if you're a politician, you're going to hear all day long people say, I'm just, from humble beginnings, and they want to portray that they're just an average, everyday, run-of-the-mill guy. President Obama was really effective at doing that, and President Obama didn't come from a ton of money. Most politicians, whether it's state or federal, want to give the illusion that they're just a regular guy that lives next door to you, and they can relate to you. And that's probably, again, as we've mentioned before, one of the things that President Trump, in some ways really tries to say he is, but in other ways he ran against that tide, and saying, yeah, I'm wealthy, I'm successful, and if you want to become wealthy and successful, follow me. And Jackson was wealthy and successful and said, no, I want to give people the belief that they can do this. And so he's going to actually ease the voting requirements. And so we're going to have a lot more people vote. That's one of the, today, big area of areas of contention is, why are we taking all these people in? And the conservative Republican will say, we're letting a lot of these people in because they tend to vote Democratic and for more government and more help from the government. Therefore, it helps the Democratic Party. That's why they're letting them in. It's not because the Democrats are more caring or loving or want them to be in there with them. They don't live with these people. That's the conservative viewpoint. The Democratic viewpoint is that we should be more caring and open to those in need. Who's right? That's for you to decide. President Jackson and what's called the spoil system. Jackson's administration puts a huge value on rewarding people that helped him get elected to office. And this is called the spoil system. So if you were there to help President Jackson and you were a close friend, you became somebody within the federal government. And that is it still happens today. We still reward people that help other people's campaigns. And both parties do it. President Trump has done it with some of his cabinet appointees. President Obama did it with some of his cabinet appointees. And it's, you wash my back, I'll wash your back. The last issue I want to look at is the idea of, as we start to move more and more west and the country grows, we become, and this will be an ongoing issue that we have, we run into more and more Indians and different Indian tribes. And as we run into them, white man, European white Anglo-Saxon man will run across Native American man, and we will have conflict, and there'll be wars and there'll be disputes. And typically what ends up happening is white guy will take the land from the Indian because he represents the United States federal government, and Indian will be moved to some other portion of the country or put on a reservation within that territory or state itself. And we're going to, especially underneath Andrew Jackson, we start to make treaties as we move more west, there's going to be the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which took a variety of Indian tribes, most famously the Cherokee Indian tribe, and we will relocate them and move them out west. And then as we get farther out west, then we'll move some of them back east again, and then we'll also put them on Indian reservations. But for now, we're going to move them more and more out west and take their land, and we'll take away great land, very fertile, good land to plant and to raise crops and farm animals, and we'll put them on some really bad reservation land. And Trail of Tears is the one of the ones mentioned in the book. It's a great illustration of how poorly we treat the Indians. The Cherokee, by and large, is one of these Indian tribes that we move from the Missouri Valley and we move them some 1,100 miles west, and we don't give them any aid. And so in their journey out west, we enforce that they have to move. The white man continually presses them to get out of the way. And in their trip out to the west, to their new homeland in Montana, a territory will be of Montana and that. And I think that's it, Montana. They'll lose a quarter of their people. Their entire population will die of starvation and of no place they can stay. The elements are so cold in that. And so the Trail of Tears is a really good example of a very poor time where we're going to kind of say, not kind of, we will, when I say we, the United States government will say to those that they're stronger than, we're going to do this and we're going to justify our actions because it's in the best interest of the United States. And it is not in the best interest of Native Americans, and we'll treat them very poorly. And I think we've got a film clip that we're going to take a look at that now. So we're going to stop there, and we'll move forward with one more installment.